Good morning. We are going to dive in and study Daniel chapter 3. So, at this point in time, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, better known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are somewhere in their 30s during this chapter. It's likely that Jerusalem has fallen and that the exiles are thinking that God has left them. So we are down here in around 586, 587, 588 BC. So we're going to begin by reading verses 1 through 6 of chapter 3 if you want to follow along. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and he set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all of the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the advisors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all of the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all other kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Whoa, so that is our welcome. So Nebuchadnezzar decides to make an image. Now, we're not told what that image is. You can see here that it's an image of a man, but we don't really know that. All we know are its dimensions, which was 90 feet high, and it was put in the plain of Dura. It's thought that this statue was probably erected to honor either Nebuchadnezzar's father or his god Bel. And he invites everyone who is anyone to this statue's dedication. It is a big deal, an august event. High officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, people from the legal community like judges and magistrates, and all of the provincial officials came. And it says that not once, but twice in these first 6 verses. They all come to this event. And he has completed it. To add to the festivities, he has a complete orchestra here, and we see all of the different musical instruments outlined here in detail 4 times in this chapter. And there's a herald to be the master of ceremonies. Now, this herald, he doesn't start with a welcome, but a violent warning in this rally of sorts. And he says, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you're commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the instruments and music, you must all fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." So at the sound of the music, they are all to fall down and worship the image. And so this is their welcome to these festivities. A violent welcome, if you will. So let's continue on with verses 7 through 12. "Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, and all kinds of music, all of the nations and people of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up.'" So here we go. So by this time, the Babylonian Empire is at its peak of power. They have conquered many nations. There are a lot of different nationalities and a lot of different languages. in the empire, and they are all here. So it says all of the nations and the peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold. And we're going to see this later on in our lives. Well, hopefully we'll be all gone by then. But in Revelation, it says the same thing is going to happen when all of the nations worship the beast. So this gives us a foreshadow of that. Only at that time, it's going to be a voluntary thing that they do this. Revelations 13 tells us the whole world was filled with the wonder and followed the beast. People worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast, and they also worshiped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? And so this is a foreshadow of what's going to happen at the end of time when there's another kingdom that we're going to study about in a couple of weeks that comes to power at the time that Jesus is coming back. So back to our Babylonian Daniel story here. So there are lots of jealousies regarding Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. There have been since they were promoted, no doubt, and people are always watching them to see how they can implicate them in some impropriety. But unfortunately, they live such upright lives for these jealous actors that the only opportunities to go after them is in relationship to worship and in relationship to their God. So here they have their case. So these jealous actors all get together. They go tell the king that there's a rebellion against him. Now that's a serious matter when it comes to a king, and they describe it in a way that puts the king in a tough position. But it also appeals to his volatile ego, of which is legendary in Babylon. They said, there's some Jews that you did this. You've set them over the affairs of the province. Then he names them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in case you want to know who they are. And they're not paying any attention to you. And just like Darius we'll find in chapter 6 with the lion's den, they remind the king that he has issued a decree and everyone is to bow down at the sound of the music. Now, this is a not so subtle reminder that the nation rises and falls on the enforcement of the king's decrees. Now, this king, Nebuchadnezzar, he is an absolute monarch. He is in control of this entire empire, and to let this go on such an august occasion when he has made such a big deal, he has written the decree, he has made an announcement by the herald, everybody knows, and everybody that's in any kind of position, a political or governmental position is there, where this opening ceremony has announced the consequences of defying this decree would weaken his kingship and his kingdom, and he knows that, so they've got him. So they position the accusation in such a way that the king has to defend their honor. After all, he's the one that appointed them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to be their boss. Now here they are, the innocents, right? The accusers, they're being obedient to the king. They have to report these rebellious Jews who dishonor the king. And to top it off, they say, and they don't listen to you about anything. And see, here's the evidence. They're not listening to you about this. So, they've got their case right there in front of them. And we see the same thing in chapter 6 with the lion's den. These jealous parties, they use politics to attack their adversaries. So this is an age-old game. This wasn't invented by the Democrats and Republicans. This has been going on forever. And they set up a situation where they corner the king with his own words or his actions. And we know that Satan is behind them, but we also know that God is going to use this for the greater good of his purpose, because he has a greater plan. And we know that all things work together for good for them who love the Lord. And we're going to see that unfold in this chapter, which is very exciting. So let's proceed to verses 13 through 15. Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Here we go. So we see the king's volatility here once again, as we have all through Daniel so far, and we'll see, up until the time of his death or his humbling, let's put it that way. And we see it here again. He flies into a rage and he demands that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought to him. And at this point, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they're big deals. They have high positions in Babylon. A lot of people reporting to them, especially these jealous actors. So, and also the Jews are watching them. And whatever happens to them is going to spread like wildfire through this kingdom. And if you remember in chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar thought these men were 10 times better than any of those in his whole kingdom. And he promoted them when he promoted Daniel, and Daniel says, hey, let me have Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to help me out with being sort of the prime minister of the province here. And after he interpreted the dream. And so they were not strangers to him. He knew who they were. And so he gives them a second chance. Now you got to ask yourself, why would Nebuchadnezzar give these guys a second chance? Because he says, whoever doesn't follow this edict is going to be thrown into the fire. Well, it could have been, he says, it could be a misunderstanding, right? We already know that he doesn't trust his wise men. We know that from chapter 2, when he tells them that he believes they're likely to conspire to lie to him about this dream. So maybe he's given Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego the benefit of the doubt that they have misunderstood his command. Maybe that they're misrepresenting the facts. So maybe he's in a fact gathering mode. Maybe he likes them. We know he liked them. He promoted them, right? If you've ever been in business and promoted someone or hired someone, you have an invested interest in wanting them to succeed and do well. So he probably also had that same human nature kind of consideration, and he probably wanted to save face to show that he had chosen well, that he had chosen wisely. So he gives them a second chance, but he doesn't just send someone else to talk to them. He appeals to them directly and personally. Otherwise, he would have thrown them immediately into the fire without delay, right? Regardless of what we think might have been going on in his mind, we know this: it was God's plan. God was going to use this situation to show a few things. He was going to show his power and his might over this mighty earthly monarch that he had put in place, and everyone was going to see it. He was going to show his arm of protection over his faithful servants in the most dire of situations for everyone to see. He was going to show that a challenge to God, or to challenging God to a duel, is futile. And that's what he's going to show as he sets this up, just like he set Daniel up in chapter 2 that we haven't studied yet, but it's miraculous. So the timing of this event is also of particular importance because it's around the time of the fall of Jerusalem. Many of the Jews are now waking up. Remember, Jeremiah was preaching to them. Ezekiel was preaching to the exiles, and they were both telling them, Jerusalem is going to fall because of your sin, because of your unrepentant hearts. And they said, no, this isn't going to last long, because there were false prophets going around telling all of them, hey, don't worry, this is going to be a short captivity. Well, now they're waking up to the fact that they're going to spend a long time, and some of them their entire lives. Daniel spent his entire life in captivity. Probably so did Ezekiel, as far as we know. And they're going to spend it in this place, this enemy camp, this place of captivity. And up until now, as far as the Jews were concerned, God had always been in a place. He had been in the tabernacle to begin with, and then he moved to the temple in Jerusalem. So he was in a place, and they were not where they thought he was. So many of them would wonder if God had forsaken them in this enemy land. And that was a valid concern. So this event is going to go far in restoring their hope and their confidence that God has not forsaken them. This is also the first time that we see captives in complete rebellion against Nebuchadnezzar. We haven't seen this so far in Scripture. And we know that these young men, we're told in the first chapter that God made them wise, and they have picked their battles wisely. But they have chosen this hill as the one they're willing to die on, quite literally. It's not Nebuchadnezzar's approval that they're worried about, it's God's approval. And that's a good lesson for us today. So that takes us to our first takeaway. We must live our lives to honor God, because the world is watching, and God is honored or dishonored by the way we live our lives and by the decisions that we make. So, let's read 16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." So again, we see these men's integrity in that they honor this earthly king. They call him your majesty. They don't defame him. They don't challenge him. They recognize that he has every right to throw them in the furnace if that's what he so desires. But they do want him to know why they can't obey this command to worship this image. And the truth is, explaining their reasons for not bowing the knee to this image and for trusting in their God might be the last words that the king or anyone else hears them utter. So it is important that they say this. They tell Nebuchadnezzar that even if God doesn't rescue them from the sentence that he's imposing, that they won't worship his idol or serve his gods. So not only have they staked this very moment on God, they have staked their complete future on God. What a lesson for us today, right? They've made a conscious decision that be it life or death, that they are going to serve the Lord. They are putting themselves totally in God's hands. That takes us to our second takeaway. The hill we choose to die on is only glorious if it's in the movies like Braveheart. He had a glorious hill to die on, or if it's recorded in history, as many of the martyrs were. But most likely our hills are going to be small and lonely places where we stand alone against the crowds that are anxious to bow the knee to the things that dishonor God in our lifetime. And so we have to be willing to pick our hill and to stand on it, to recognize it's probably going to be like the cross of Jesus, a dark and lonely place. It's not going to be a glorious Braveheart place. So we just need to know that. So let's read 19 through 25. Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing fire. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." So we're told here that his attitude towards them changed. And just as he issued the violent warning in the opening ceremony, just as he was furious in chapter 2, that so furious that he was going to kill all the wise men of Babylon, and just as he was furious when he heard these men wouldn't bow the knee to his idol, he becomes not only furious, but maniacal at their unwillingness to bow the knee. He's also likely furious because he went out on a limb for these guys. He offered them a second chance. Not only offered them a second chance, but in a very public way. And he probably wouldn't have ordinarily have done that. And so he probably feels that they embarrassed him by disobeying his order. And in fact, they probably did. Because since the Babylonians worshipped many gods, it's unlikely that he cared if they worshipped another god. What was another god? But a monarch like him, a mighty monarch like him, the first world empire like his, they can't allow insubordination of his leaders or his rule will be weakened. And if we look throughout these lessons, it's in the face of this volatile rage that we see God's glorious provision and protection unfold time after time. And that's important because we can't fully appreciate God as the healer until we see the raging disease from which he saves us or cures us. It's just like we can't appreciate being healed from cancer until we grasp its ultimatum. I'm going to kill you, it's saying to you. That's what I am. I'm cancer and I'm coming for you. And unless you get treated or healed, I'm going to take your life. And we can't understand how God heals us until we see the depths of our spiritual depravity and illness and weakness. And so it's in the face of this volatile rage that we see God in his healing and provision and protecting power. So back to the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as if the fire is not hot enough to kill them, he orders the furnace to be heated up 7 times its normal temperature. And here he throws down the gauntlet to God. He said, here's what God can save you from my hand. You know, he really believes that it's been in his power that he's done everything he's done. Here's a man who has conquered the world, but he has no idea that the God of heaven has given him the power to accomplish what he's accomplished. And he has no idea that God has actually given him the dominion over these nations. So as these young men are getting ready to be thrown in the fire, it seems a little extreme to tie them up, since the ropes are going to be burned off in the fire. So this is obviously done to terrorize them. Or maybe he thought they would fight. And that seems to be what he anticipates, because he commands his strongest soldiers to throw them in, which is probably designed to terrorize them all the more, because maybe they didn't look frightened enough. I mean, they've put their lives in the hands of the Almighty God, and maybe they had a peace about them in that. And maybe he says, hey, I'm going to shake you up. I'm going to show you I'm going to shake you up. And unfortunately for the Babylonians, these strong men that were throwing them into the fire, they perished as they threw them in. Now Nebuchadnezzar, no doubt through all this, he wants to demonstrate all of the power that he has available. He's got a fire 7 times hotter than normal. He's got power to execute immediate judgment against these men, and he has an army of soldiers at his command that will execute any plans that he deems necessary. And he says, good luck to your God in saving you from this. And so God is allowing him to double down on his threats or on his bets. It's like Elijah and the prophets of Baal, remember, throwing water after water after water on the altar. And then Elijah asking him to bring down the fire, right? He doesn't know who he's dealing with. He really thinks he has all of the power and he's holding all of the cards. He has no idea. And then the unbelievable happens. God shows the king and everybody in attendance that Nebuchadnezzar's fire is so hot that it can even kill those on the outside of the furnace, but that his protection is so strong that it can protect those on the inside of the furnace where the fire is the hottest. And if we don't remember anything else from this lesson, we should remember that no matter what, God is there to protect us. And that's our takeaway 3. God is always able to help us, even when we are going through an unbelievably hot fire. But the one thing he does require of us is to be willing to fully surrender, even in the midst of that fire. And that's a hard thing to do. That is a hard thing to do. So let's finish up our chapter, verses 26 through 30. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except for their God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego will be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king pronounced Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So interestingly enough, Nebuchadnezzar seems unfazed about the death of his strongest soldiers, which tells us about the darkness of his heart. But he sees it. He sees these men are still alive and they're walking in the fire. And then he sees the 4th man walking around in the fire, all unharmed, because God always supplies a guardian. Remember that there are chariots of fire all around. I love that from Elijah. So he always has his guardians around his people, whether we see them or not. Unfortunately, Nebuchadnezzar saw them. And his response to this is startling. He said, he goes up to the furnace and he goes close enough in order for them to hear his voice. So he's got to be fairly close. And he says, "Servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." And he calls them by name, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He knew who they were. I think he knew from the very beginning who they were. And he doesn't just call them to come out, but he recognizes the reason that they're still alive because of their belief in the God of heaven by saying, "Servants of the Most High God, come out." He said that before he said their names. Now, can you imagine the curiosity of this scene, the violence, the intensity of the preparation to set an example not to defy this king? And then for these men to come walking out of this fire? Wow, it's unbelievable. And all the officials were close enough to smell them. It preserves the witness, right? It documents this forever, that there was no scorching on their clothes, their hair, or their skin. There was no smell of fire on them. Has anyone ever been in a burned building or smelled the smells of fire? It's horrible. It's a horrible smell, and it's a smell that clings to you. And Nebuchadnezzar, fortunately, recognizes that this is a divine act. Actually, the fact that he wasn't killed when he went to the entrance of this furnace and shouted out to them is also a divine act, because he apparently was close enough for them to hear his voice, and a roaring fire is a loud thing also. And he immediately says, "Praise be to God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who sent his angel and rescued his servants." And even though at this point he's a wicked king, he does recognize honor in men, and he praises them for defying him, basically, for going to their death rather than serving any god but their own. Even he recognizes that honor. So as for Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, which are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, They no doubt expected to die in this experience, but they put themselves completely in God's hands. And this must have emboldened them and emboldened their faith for the rest of their lives. But we don't know. We assume that that's the truth, and I believe it's the truth, but this is the last we'll hear about them and their story in the book of Daniel. Now, as for the captive Jews, the word had to have spread like wildfire that God had saved these men who were willing to die for their faith. And this new decree that Nebuchadnezzar signed would have protected them from refusing to worship Babylonian idols. So that's another thing that God accomplished in this scenario. As for Daniel, we're not told where he is at this time. He wasn't at this event. He's not mentioned in this chapter. We can only assume that he was attending to the king's business somewhere else. And as for Nebuchadnezzar, his realization about God, the God of heaven, never seems to last. You know, after Daniel's interpretation of his dream, he praised God and he promoted Daniel and his friends. And now he appears to accept the power and the greatness of the God of heaven again. But unfortunately, that's not going to last either. But God will completely humble him at one place in his life before his reign is over, and we'll see that. And it will hold at that time. Now, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledges that God has won this battle. He has won this challenge. He recognizes his power. But the very next thing he does shows how violent his heart still is. He is not yet a changed man, even though he has witnessed the unparalleled power of God. He sets a new decree in place, and he says this: anyone who says anything against the God of the Jews, he's going to cut them in pieces. He's going to destroy their houses. He's going to reduce them to rubble. That's going to protect the Jews for generations to come. And no doubt the harshness of that statement and that decree and the hardness of it is intended to threaten anyone who would do that. But we still see that this king, he still has he's still a raging king. He still has a violent heart. And that brings us to our last takeaway, that we must pray to trust in God for our deliverance, whether it be in life or death, as we face the consequences of honoring him with our lives. It might be in little things, it might be in big things. In this country at this time, we're still allowed to worship as we see fit. Will we live to see the day we won't? I hope not. But we must be willing to put ourselves in God's hands, just like these men did, and trust God for the deliverance, be it in life or death. Thank you so much for listening to this lesson, and let me say a prayer for us. Dear Heavenly Father, we just thank you so much for showing us your word, for giving us its living content, dear Father, that this was over 2,500 years ago, and it still is alive and relevant for us today, and that's the way your word is. And dear Father, just help us to take it to heart, help us to honor you in the lives that we lead, and help us to remember that the world is watching, dear Father, and just help us to live for you. In Jesus' holy name we pray. Amen.